Russia has suffered what may be its worst month for oil attacks, but its forces in Ukraine are still blasting forward. North Korean soldiers, though, have withdrawn from the front line after suffering eye-watering losses. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news and analysis from the war in Ukraine. Russian forces continue to blast their way forwards on the battlefield in Ukraine, particularly around the southern eastern front line in Donetsk, around Velika Novosilka, which they claim to have captured, and Toretsk, we understand, could fall any minute, and that is part of their offensive around south of Konstantinivka and towards the town of Pokrovsk. But it comes against a backdrop that we've seen not just in the last week but over the whole of January of sustained Ukrainian long-range attacks targeting Russian oil refineries, Russian depots, and indeed munition storage warehouses and factories producing arms inside Russia. And this is part of a long-running campaign, but what's interesting is we see Ukraine shifting focus from time to time. There was a part of this war when we were talking almost every week about strikes in the Black Sea against Russian shipping. Ukraine appears at the moment to have shifted its focus away from that, and its resources are being directed north and east of Ukrainian-held territory. In the last month alone, we have seen strikes on at least 6 oil depots and 4 oil refineries. That may not be an exhaustive list, but I'll rattle through some of them now. On the 4th of January, long-range strike in Luga near Leningrad, some 800 kilometers inside Russian territory. 8th of January, fuel depots near the Engels air base, vital for fueling Russia's strategic bombers, was hit. The 11th of January, there was a strike against a refinery in Nizhnekamsk. That's 1,100 miles inside Russian territory. The 13th of January in Bryansk, a chemicals plant. We talked about that before, hit with ATACMS, that plant producing vital ingredients for the missile program. 14th of January in Saratov, a refinery 600 kilometers inside Russia. The next day, the 15th, an oil depot in Lysky, just 100 kilometers inside Russian territory. The 17th, another depot in Kaluga, about 200 kilometers inside Russian territory. The 18th of January, another depot in Tula, about 300 kilometers inside Russian territory. On January, there was a sort of bit of a gap between the 18th and the 24th of January, as far as I can tell. But on the 24th, a depot in Ryazan hit again the next night straight away. That was about 500 kilometers inside Russian territory. On the 26th in Oryol, this was an ammunition depot, fuels holding thermobaric weapons, we think, and warheads. On the 28th of January in Kostovo, a refinery was hit, some 800 kilometers inside Russia, and also at the same time an arsenal, a weapons arsenal hit near Tver. Most recently on the 29th, in the pumping station for the Druzhba pipeline was hit, about 140 kilometers inside Russia near the border with Belarus. Finally, on the 31st, the night into the 31st of January, an oil depot and refinery hit in Volgograd, around 250 kilometers inside Russia. All of this is important because whilst Ukraine is ceding territory, it's losing soldiers, it's suffering, there's no doubt about it inside Ukraine. We never try to sugarcoat that, but nonetheless it is fighting back with this very deliberate target of strikes against Russian energy infrastructure, not designed to, like Russia's campaign, to try and plunge civilians into darkness, but very specifically designed to try and starve the Russian armed forces of the fuel that they need to prosecute this war. As always, it's worth having a look at just some of the amazing footage that has come out this week, because despite the fact that it's been nearly 3 years of conflict, we do still see things that surprise us. And the thing that really caught my eye this week was a clip of a Ukrainian drone loitering in the grass beside the road, waiting for a target to come past. And when that target came past, it was a Russian Buchanka bus, a Russian military minibus. The drone hops into the air, follows it and attacks it. Now, we've seen drones attacking vehicles almost every day of this conflict. That's become one of the defining things. But what was interesting is obviously these drones have a limited range, they have a limited battery life, and if they're in the sky and if they're communicating with their controller, then all of those things provide vulnerabilities. The batteries can run out, they can go out of range, and the communications can be jammed. But if a drone can wait effectively in ambush, then of course that extends the time and therefore the likelihood of hitting a target. So an interesting just tactical development in how these drones are being used. We've also seen some black and white, what appears to be thermal imagery of Ukrainian forces operating in the Dnipro River on boats laying mines. Now, that was particularly interesting to me because I was on that river with Ukrainian forces about 18 months ago where they were sailing out. The river was the front line, so we were on a speedboat effectively patrolling or making a foray into that front line, and that continues to be the front line. Ukrainian forces have crossed it, have skirmished across it to try and take ground, but ever since Russian forces withdrew from Kherson, the Dnipro River generally speaking, marks large parts of that front line. And certainly the further you go towards the mouth of the river, Ukraine holds what is north and west of the river, Russia holds what is south and east. But seeing soldiers there operating with mines, laying mines, again in ambush, so using ambush tactics really for Russian forces operating by boat and just making that river dangerous, increasing the jeopardy. And I'm sure both sides are probably doing this, creating jeopardy for both sides operating on that front line. And the other thing that caught my attention was footage of Smerch rockets being launched. Smerch are large rockets, area weapons launched off the back of a truck, off a sort of mobile launcher. Much like the Grad system, they're just bigger and more powerful. I've been on the other end of Grads. This was footage of I've been on the wrong end of Grads and Smerch missiles hitting cities and neighbourhoods that I've been in over the course of the war. We've seen a lot of the Grads. They're smaller. They're effectively the descendants, if you like, or the modern evolutions of the weapons known as Stalin's organ that we used during World War II. They are area weapons. They're not particularly accurate, certainly not as accurate as things like the GMLRS system, the HIMARS system that America and the United Kingdom have given Ukraine, but nonetheless very powerful. And the reason it was interesting is we haven't seen that footage very much. Quickly, I wanted to touch on the mood about peace talks. Obviously, ever since Donald Trump was inaugurated, his promise to end this war in 24 hours has been in the back of our minds. It's been a lot longer than 24 hours. The conflict is still raging. His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said recently that neither side will achieve its maximalist ambitions. That's interesting, and to unpack it, what he is saying is that Russia will not conquer all of Ukraine. It will not get a Russian-friendly government in Kyiv, because that is what Russia wants. It will not subsume or destroy Ukraine's national identity. Those are Russia's maximalist ambitions. But nor, he is saying, will Ukraine achieve its maximalist ambitions. And Ukraine's ambitions are to push Russia out of all of its territory, to return itself to the 1991 state borders at the point it achieved its independence. So Rubio saying, on behalf of America, neither side will achieve those goals. Interestingly, Vladimir Putin has also been talking about negotiations. He said he thought the war could be over in 2 months. Now, that slightly echoes a comment by Donald Trump's special envoy, who said that the war could be ended in 100 days of Trump's inauguration. But they're saying these things for different reasons. Putin is saying the war would end in 2 months if America stopped giving Ukraine military support. And this is really part of Putin's narrative now, that Ukraine is simply a vassal state, a puppet doing the bidding of America. And whilst Putin is claiming that he's ready to negotiate, really he's saying he won't negotiate with Ukraine and he will only negotiate with America. Before we get to questions, very briefly, a quick touch on Ukrainian politics, military politics. President Zelensky has removed the commander of the Southern Forces Command and brought him into the ministry, or brought him into sort of the general staff in Kyiv, or in military headquarters. And there's an ongoing row at the moment between the head of Ukraine's defense procurement agency, Marina Bezrukova, and the Ministry of Defense, led by Defense Minister Rustam Umerov. She has been suspended. She's resisting that. She's appealed very publicly on Facebook to President Zelensky to intervene. Why does this matter? Because it's just not what Ukraine needs at a time like this, when it needs to be focusing all of its resources on defending its territory, on trying to roll back where it can the Russian invasion, or to inflict costs on Russia for that invasion. For government officials, senior government officials in such important roles in developing, channeling in weapons, buying weapons, manufacturing weapons for the armed forces to keep them in the fight, they don't need officials to be fighting like this and fighting so publicly. The G7 nations have called for a swift resolution, an indication that they see this as problematic. And indeed, Ukraine's anti-corruption organisation says it's opened an investigation into the defence minister for abuse of power, not for corruption at this stage, but for abuse of power. I said that was the final point. Actually, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on before we get to questions, and that's a sort of simmering controversy over a documentary film called Russians at War, which is brewing because this documentary film is being shown at film festivals, particularly a film festival in Australia. And the retired General Mick Ryan, or former general, who's now a sort of think tank analyst, prominent commentator on the conflict, Mick Ryan, has called it Russian propaganda and says it shouldn't be shown at film festivals. He's saying it portrays Russians as normal soldiers. He's saying they are no such things. They've perpetrated hundreds of thousands of war crimes. And in a tweet he shared, he's saying, what next? Documentaries about the SS, the Gestapo, portraying them as normal soldiers. I have to say, this is an opinion and it might not be popular with many frontline viewers, but I'm going to say actually I think it's important that documentaries, that films like this are aired, that we do get an opportunity to see the other side of the conflict, because ultimately these conflicts are perpetrated by human beings on both sides. And if we can perhaps grasp the humanity of some of the people fighting, waging this war on Russia's behalf, then that may encourage appetite on both sides for peace. And I've always said no sane person should want this war to last a second longer than it has to, but how it ends is important. And we've talked about that before, and if you'd like to, we can talk about that in more depth. If you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. And of course, if you'd like to become a member, if you'd like to join Frontline, then you can do so by clicking the link at the end of this video or clicking the link on the Sun's YouTube page, and you'll get early access, exclusive access, or access to exclusive content. You get to use, you get special badges on YouTube and access to unique emojis only available to members, and that helps your comments and questions stand out. And of course, I will make real effort to answer them either in the next episode or in the comments. Question number one. Why is North Korean support for Russia such big news, so controversial, when the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe and other allies are helping Ukraine? It's a good question. Fundamentally, it's because North Korea's support is of a different order of magnitude. North Korea has sent between 11,000 and 12,000 soldiers to Russia to fight. So its soldiers have engaged in battle against Ukraine. It was already, prior to that, supplying military material. It was supplying around 3 million artillery shells a month. I think it's the KN-23 ballistic missile. And with these soldiers, it's also now started supplying artillery systems, tracked mobile howitzer guns and multiple launch rocket systems. But it's the fact that it's sending uniformed soldiers is the difference. What the West has been doing, what Ukraine's allies have been doing is primarily supplying military equipment. They've sent tanks, they've sent fighter jets, they've sent rocket launchers, but they have not sent battalions of uniformed soldiers to fight on the front line with Ukraine, and that's what makes that different. Also on North Korea, because that was what we were really talking about last week, next question is again about the supply lines. How are these weapons getting to Russia, and is there not a way of interdicting that supply line? The answer remains the same. Russia and North Korea share a land border, so those weapons can be delivered by train. It's also quite feasible they might be shipped in by sea, but To interdict that would require a strike at the far eastern edge of Russia, because that is where those countries share that border, at the absolute furthest range for anything that Ukraine might want to do. And it's not something that the rest of the international community can get involved in, because that would require some sort of interruption or sabotage or attack on sovereign North Korean or sovereign Russian soil. And that's an escalation that the West, America, NATO, not prepared to make, because it would spiral the conflict into a direct confrontation rather than a proxy confrontation between Russia and the West. How many dead and wounded has Ukraine lost is the next question. It's a really good question, and the short answer is we don't know. Our estimates of both sides' losses are estimates, and we don't make them ourselves. We rely on external sources, primarily on the militaries involved who make them themselves. Towards the end of last year, NATO said the conflict had cost 1 million casualties, both dead and injured, across both sides. Now, when they said that, when NATO Secretary General said that, the estimate for Russian losses was about 750,000. So from that, we have extrapolated that Ukraine has lost around 250,000 soldiers, both dead and wounded. It is a huge number, and that is why we've touched on before, Ukraine is having a huge struggle, a huge concern, is replenishing its armed forces with fit, able and willing fighting men and women. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll try and answer them next time. If you're a member or you'd like to join Frontline, then please do. In this week's members only content, we're going to be discussing Russia's attempt to crack down on the free media, and indeed on people like me. I have personal experience of this, because just this week a court in Russia has issued an arrest warrant for me and has ordered my detention in absentia for the crime of crossing the state border illegally, and that's because I travelled into occupied Russia in August, into that patch of territory that Ukraine had captured in order to report on what was going on from there. And as a result of which, I am now, according to Russia, on an international wanted list. So if you'd like to know more about that, then please do join Frontline, and you can watch the exclusive members only content.